what do you think about purpose? I guess before I encountered the Dharma, my understanding of purpose is always has been anything that's aligned with my quote unquote life goal. Like this huge, big purpose. So anything that doesn't align with it, I always feel like, oh, I'm not on my purpose. I always feel defeated or whatever. Recently, I have a huge shift in how I understand it. Basically, just anything that makes me feel very present-minded, really immersed in what's happening, it feels very purposeful to me. Something as simple as brushing my teeth, just waking up, just getting dressed, it just feel purpose to me. So I was curious how you see purpose, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think good guidance on that question is to look at the Buddha's life, right? The Buddha's life story in a lot of ways is all we really need to understand. I mean, you can say that about just about any sutta in the Pali Canon. That could be all you need to understand if you look at it deeply. But the Buddha's life story is very instructive in terms of your question. So, his life exemplifies two different ways that life can be lived, especially the spiritual life, right? He was raised in something like a palace, he was something like a prince. I'm saying something like, as historians disagree about these things, but the story goes that a seer predicted that he would either be a world-turning monarch or that he would become a Buddha. He would renounce the worldly life and become a Buddha. And his father wanted him to be a ruler, so he raised him in an environment where his skin never came in contact with rough textures. He had a different home for every season so that he would never experience hot or cold or biting insects. He was given the most delicious food that was available on the continent always, so he was just indulging in the greatest pleasures of each of the sense doors. He was never allowed to see an ugly sight. He was never allowed to hear an uncomfortable or disturbing sound. He had people playing beautiful music for him at all times. He had beautiful women courtesans provided to him when he reached the age that was something he'd be interested in. And so, yeah, his life was basically the height of sensual pleasure, right? And very comfortable. And, you can say that he didn't have any awareness of dukkha in that sense, in that sort of being in that padded world of pure pleasure. He was actually even guarded from sunlight, apparently. He had people following him around with umbrellas so that his skin wouldn't be touched by the sun. So, no discomfort, no displeasure. Each of the senses perfectly gratified at all times. And then, he apparently got out of the palace one day. Different versions of the story, but we'll stick to the central principle here. He made contact with the four heavenly messengers, which is old age, illness, death, and then a monk, a samana, a renunciate. So he saw an old man one day and he said, "What the hell is that?" Never seen an old man before. He saw a sick man another day, was disturbed by that. Saw a dead corpse another day, on the third day, and was deeply disturbed by this. Suddenly his fragile reality was revealed to be fragile. Essentially, it made him feel uncomfortable. And then he saw a samana, a renunciate, and he said, okay, so there's a way. He became insecure, basically. He experienced dukkha, that insecurity of life. And so he decided to solve the one question is what is dukkha and how do we bring an end to dukkha? So we can take that as our purpose, as close followers of the Buddha's teachings. which is to fully comprehend dukkha, to understand exactly what it is. We don't really know what it is. It's covered over by ignorance. It's veiled over by ignorance. And we don't understand truly what the cause of dukkha is, and we don't understand the way out of dukkha, or why we should even care, really. So we could take that as being the purpose of life, you know. And then the story goes that the Buddha spent 6 years first going through the jhanas. So he went from worldly pleasures to, you know, non-worldly pleasures, mental pleasures of jhana. And then, of course, he went through all the ascetic practices, complete self-mortification, and, you know, these extremes didn't get him out of there. And this is comparable to how a lot of us pursue spiritual practices. We either give in to craving, which is, you can define that as wanting things we don't have, or doing things to get things, doing things to feel better, acquiring things to feel better. So this fulfilling this sense of perpetual dissatisfaction that lives inside of us, unaware of where that dissatisfaction comes from. We cover it up with stimulating the senses. So that's one extreme. You know, you can just do everything craving wants. You can look at the body with its urges and say, okay, the body is a natural organism, and who am I to judge those urges, and just give the body everything it wants, and thus kind of feel a sense of ease from doing that. But if you look a little bit deeply, you'll see that that's ultimately unsatisfying, right? And then, you know, the Buddha tried to punish the body to the point of burning up past karma, an old idea they had in India. We don't have too much of this anymore, but we do have ways of punishing ourselves through self-criticism. He found that didn't work. So the purpose here is then to understand the middle way, which is a synonym for the Dhamma, right? It's to understand that ignorantly gratifying all of our desires is not going to bring an end to dukkha. In fact, it's feeding the cause of the problem, and then you know, punishing ourselves constantly, punishing the body, punishing ourselves with physical mortification or even mental self-mortification, that self-criticism that many of us are familiar with, judging ourselves, hating ourselves, punishing ourselves, always feeling not good enough, is another way another mistake that we make. So the middle way is really about inviting the mind back into itself, and turning the attention around and looking within continuously and long enough, breaking that habit of going out to the senses, of going out and gratifying all of our desires, and bringing the mind sort of back home within itself, in order to kind of pull the veil back and see what's really driving our lives. So Ivan, you talked about your previous sense of purpose, right? That comes from our parents, our culture, and our own sense of self, which is craving in disguise, until we see dukkha and we see its cause, and we see dependent origination. We identify as craving. We essentially are our craving, which is why we kind of feel a sense of anxiety when we stop feeding our desires. So that's why the Buddha says, you know, go to the forest, go to an empty hut, go to the foot of a tree. Basically, take yourself out of the environment that you're used to, where your sense of self is continuously being fed, and cut that all off. You know, it's like taking the mind and putting it into a drug rehab. You will see that as soon as you're no longer feeding your habits, you're not talking to yourself, you're not talking to others, you're not going about your normal habits of keeping yourself distracted. Very quickly, within a few minutes, you start to feel withdrawals. You start to feel pretty awful. Essentially, it's like withdrawals from drugs, right? If any of you have gone to a silent retreat, It's not pleasant, right? For a while, it's pretty terrible. But what that reveals is how enslaved the mind is by craving. It's being dragged hither and thither, to and fro, by craving. But you kind of have to cut off that samsaric cycle in order to see through it. So from a Dhammic perspective, this is our purpose. It's to truly see dukkha, understand what it is, at a very fundamental level, in order to become disenchanted by the world that craving creates for us to live within, sort of like that world the Buddha was raised in, right? Symbolically, it's sort of like the world that craving creates for us to live in, so that we don't understand that we're kind of being hidden from reality, and to break this cycle of constantly feeling dissatisfied, constantly feeling the sense of lack that we then need to fill, because we'll just get dragged around by that and go our whole lives living unconsciously, pushed and pulled around by this mechanism that's inside of us, reaching the end of our life one day and realizing that we sort of were asleep our whole lives. And so, purpose of Buddhism is to sort of almost experience that death long before we die, the death of this self that's fabricated by craving, and to see it for what it is, so that we can wake up and be satisfied and happy now. And that sounds quite complicated, and I'd like to connect it a little bit to the way that Dhammarato teaches, because Dhammarato is constantly telling us to sort of be, don't worry, be happy, just to sort of be satisfied. And the way that I understand this and the way that it's affected me in a positive way is that the normal narrative is that we have to do things and get things or be something in order to be satisfied. When I graduate from high school, when I graduate from college, when I get that job, then I'll be satisfied. When I get the house, when I get the right relationship, then I'll be happy, right? We're sort of taught that happiness, satisfaction, peace of mind comes at the end of some acquisition. And if you're here in this chat, you've probably already realized that that's not going to bring you happiness, right? If you're attracted to the Dhamma at all, you've probably already kind of not broken that cycle, but seen through it a little bit. You're looking for something that's more stable. You've seen the unreliability, the impermanence, the unownability of that pursuit. We come to the Dhamma, and we're told, here are these jhanas, here are these attainments, here's this nibbana. And then so we kind of leave behind that worldly pursuit, and we start this sort of spiritual pursuit for happiness. And what Dhammarato is telling us is that you can drop all of those pursuits right now and simply be satisfied with things exactly as they are, right? Everything is already okay. Nothing is missing. Everything is okay exactly as it is. One samsara is this worldly samsara that tells us that we have to do things and get things to be happy. This other samsara is the spiritual samsara that tells us that we have to gain certain states of meditation and certain attainments in order to be happy. And because we're at this point in history where this has all been explored for so long, and there's been so many people who've sort of cut through that Gordian knot, we have the opportunity to, if we can understand it deeply, to sort of let go of everything and just be happy and satisfied with things exactly as they are right now. And that's really what the purpose of the Dhamma is. And when you break that cycle of craving, then you no longer have to be driven by craving. You can sort of use the mindfulness and wisdom that is born of that clarity that comes from stopping and being satisfied. Then you start to see things more clearly, and you can start to know more about what to do based off of wisdom rather than that greed, hatred, and delusion that kind of drags us around. So I'll leave it at that for now.
That was beautiful, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I really like hearing your point of view on subjects like this. I do have something I'd like to say about purpose. Like the way I see it is, purpose has a lot to do with the responsibility you have. It's sort of like it has to do with the ego that you have and its responsibility. So, like, if you're a parent, it's your responsibility to take care of your child, to raise them, to provide for them.
Mhm.
That's your purpose, that's your duty. If you're a student, your purpose is to learn, and it's to understand the subject as deeply as possible. So it's sort of like what you consider yourself to be. Your duty is, or purpose is your responsibility to like perform your task to the greatest of your ability. So
Mhm.
yeah, so if you're a parent, your responsibility is your child, that whatever depends on you. If you're a teacher, your responsibility is teaching your class in the way that they'll be able to understand. If you're a student, your responsibility is to learn as deeply as possible. And throughout your life, your purpose will obviously change as you go through life. So you might start out as a student and
Mhm.
then you become a teacher, or you become a parent, and your duty will change, your purpose will change, your responsibilities will change. So that's the way I see purpose.
Mhm. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Ajahn Buddhadasa, very well known for trying to make the Dhamma relevant to what he saw around him and to access the noble Dhamma. And one thing that he said towards that end, besides frequently talking about these little nibbana we can experience throughout the day, this going directly from dissatisfaction into a state of satisfaction, he called those little nibbanas. He talked about Dhamma is duty, duty is Dhamma, right? And what's sort of significant about that is if we do, like you said, we have stations in life that call us to do something. The only reason that we don't want to do it is because of our selfishness, right? We have a resistance to it, or we have a desire to do something else. And selfishness is something that Ajahn Buddhadasa talked about a lot as a way of understanding anatta a little better. People get quite confused about self and not self, and the Buddha said that, be ever mindful, see the world as empty, abandon thoughts of self. If you understand that statement, clinging, it's very difficult to cling. We'll say it could come to a complete cessation just from understanding that statement. And but what self is it's a sort of a dependent epiphenomena, right? Self arises dependent on craving. So as long as craving is present in experience, there is a self there. And another thing that Ajahn Buddhadasa talked about, and that you can observe in all of your experience if you pay very close attention, is that whenever an object of desire is created in the mind, there's sensory contact. Let's say you're just walking down the street and you're sort of in a state of peace because the walk has put the mind in a state of peace. There's very little sense of self there, maybe just a little bit of a sense of self just to guide the walk, but very little, perhaps none at all, and you're just not noticing it. But then you walk past a billboard that's advertising like a McDonald's cheeseburger. And so that's contact with the eyes, and then pleasant feeling arises because you probably have some positive associations with a nice juicy hamburger if you're an American, at least.
Not from McDonald's, bro. Not
So let's just say
McDonald's.
a juicy hamburger, if you like
Okay.
hamburgers. There's a pleasant feeling arises, right? And then a desire towards that pleasant feeling arises. It's an emotional response. So once the desire arises, then the desire follows. So a self is fabricated in order to fulfill that desire. And so then that's what the upadana is. Like, it's the creation of like the me who wants the hamburger. And then there's stories and images that the mind creates, and it builds up into a feeling of like pressure inside the body, and that's that bhava, that existence. So now there's the me who wants the hamburger, and it could exist alongside other me's, right? There may be a me who's on a diet that doesn't want the hamburger, and there might be also a me who doesn't have money to buy a hamburger and feels sorry for himself because he doesn't want the hamburger. And there might also even be a me who like is annoyed that they even put up the sign, right? So you've got these conflicting desires, and each of them have their own self that they've created. But the point is that when you get to the acting out the desire, that's what's referred to as birth. And as soon as the desire is acted upon, it begins to degrade. So you get a brief reward because the pressure goes down, right? The craving sort of extinguishes for a second, or it lessens for a second. And that's what you think is the pleasure that you've now gained, but that quickly degrades, and then another desire replaces it, like the desire to not have gotten the hamburger, or a desire to not be full, or a regret about spending the money. And this is sort of what normally drags us around. If we are continuously fulfilling the first duty to the Dhamma, which is to fully comprehend exactly what dukkha is, right? And I'm talking about dukkha on somewhat of a surface level right now, but there's a deeper sense of understanding dukkha, and you could see dukkha to such a depth that it's experienced as like an agony, or a what's the word I'm looking for? An anguish, an existential anguish, when you realize that your whole life has been governed by this unconscious process, right? And you've done things and said things and been things that have hurt other people and have hurt yourself, and that you've missed so much of your life. And it can be a deep existential anguish when you see dukkha fully and completely. And that's really our first duty to the first noble truth. And then, the duty to the second noble truth is to then abandon the cause of dukkha, which is craving, right? It's this wanting what we don't have, not liking or wanting to get rid of what we don't like, and feeling sort of uncertain or confused or careless in regard to things that are aren't really clear about liking or disliking, whether it's pleasurable or not pleasurable. So there's a state of confusion. So we're either running towards things, running away from things, or spinning around in indecision. That's sort of like the three mechanical movements of the mind when it's under the influence of craving. And our duty to that second noble truth is to sort of become disgusted and abandon the whole thing, right? And that's that becoming satisfied with things as they are. This is what's misunderstood a lot, I think, in the way that Dhammarato teaches. When Dhammarato tells us to be satisfied, that doesn't mean, there's no practice. Just go and drink as much as you want, and all the other whatever indulgences, because you're not really ever going to reveal how enslaved you are by craving when you're just sort of indulging the senses in that way. It's only when you cut everything off that enslavement is truly revealed, and you have to experience the withdrawals to really experience the what's kind of keeping the mind imprisoned there. So the duty to the second noble truth is to abandon craving at a fundamental level. And I have a sort of a comparison to this, because Ajahn Buddhadasa once talked about how the Buddha made a statement, kill your mother and father. And he said, if people misunderstand that, they might go and kill their mother and father, your actual mom and dad. But that's not what the Buddha's talking about. He's talking about ignorance and craving, because, like I said, as long as craving is present in the habitat of ignorance, there is self. When this process is seen and understood to be dependently originated, that same self is seen as not self. It's still there because craving's still there, but it's seen as not self, right? And then when the whole conditioned, the whole host of causes and conditions that give rise to that self, that is the one who suffers, is destroyed, then there's no self at that point. The self
I have a
arises
question.
and passes, dependent on these ignorance and ignorance and craving. So the scene of this, the deep scene of this, I compare this to, let's say you were raised by your mother and father, and they raised you, they gave you all of your values, hopes and dreams, your ethics, your sense of who you are, your whole identity, your sense of what's right, what's wrong, everything you can think of, all the stories, all the memories. And then you came across like some piece of information that revealed to you that this mother and father who you've treasured your whole life were actually kidnappers who murdered your real mother and father and raised you as their own, right? So the whole thing comes falling apart, right? That's the scene of the Four Noble Truths at a deeper level. You come to see that that everything that you've sort of grounded yourself on, your whole sense of identity, has been fabricated by these forces that the Buddha called avijja and tanha. They're just two ends of two poles on the process, but they're the most significant ones, right? And that level of disenchantment, nibbita, that level of disenchantment, is what takes the passion out of the whole process of craving, because it's not actually the things in the world that are the problem. It's not the hamburger. It's the passion that we have towards the hamburger, and it's not whomever you don't like, Donald Trump, whatever it be. It's not Donald Trump who's the problem. I personally, have no feelings, good or bad, towards Donald Trump. I'll just say that. But let's say you hate Donald Trump. It's not him. It's the hating, right? So when we see dependent origination at this level, which is what I'm talking about in terms of the second noble truth, that ignorance and craving have built this whole world, you become disenchanted. Then you become dispassionate towards the loving and the hating, essentially, not the objects, the loving and the hating of the objects. And when that removes the fuel for the self that craving creates, and it removes essentially the one who suffers. This is why the Buddha says, the dukkha is these 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, thinking, sensory consciousness, these 5 constituents that make up all of experience. Dukkha is these 5 aggregates afflicted by upadana, the assumption of the 5 aggregates, taking them as me and mine. That's what actually causes suffering. Without the assumption of the 5 aggregates as me and mine, which happens due to craving and ignorance, there's no suffering. It's impossible. And that's what the Dhamma, is really, really about. It's about making it impossible to suffer. The body, its activities, its aging and illness, the changing states of mind, the liking and the disliking, the wanting and the not wanting, all of these things can carry on, by their own nature, when they're no longer assumed and taken up as me and mine. And there's no suffering that can arise when these aggregates are seen as they truly are, right? And that's what brings about the third noble truth, which is the cessation of dukkha, this deep relief that we feel when we put the whole world down. In fact, we realize that the whole thing is constructed, and that the aggregates that make up our entire experience are governed by nature. Our sense of self is secondary to the aggregates. They don't even know that we're here. The body doesn't know that Michael is here talking to you guys right now. The eyes that are looking at the screen have no idea that Michael is here talking to the screen. It doesn't care. The eyes don't care that I'm here. The body doesn't care that I'm here. The ears have no idea that I'm here. They don't care, right? I'm, the sense of me is a secondary phenomena that comes about from having a passion or aversion towards the aggregates of assuming them as me and mine. This is the this is where the Dhamma penetrates more deeply to make it so that suffering has no footing to arise. So yeah, I didn't mean to go down that road, but that's sort of where it went. And I'm gonna go ahead and leave it there for now and see if there's any other questions, just in case I've confused anyone.
Yo,
so go ahead.
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you can go first.
I just want to say hi to Alex Hipple. I haven't seen him. Alex, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
How's it going, friend?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. I'm glad to see you're doing well.
Yeah, glad to see you too, brother.
Cool. All right, you're gonna ask your question.
Oh,
Yeah.
is dukkha is craving a like a byproduct of the false self, or is it the false self like epitomized? Because it was something I was wondering.
It's an interesting question. So I've always said from my own experience that that the assumption of the aggregates, the taking, form, feeling, perception, thinking, sensory consciousness, the entirety of our experience, taking it personally is the result of craving. I see craving as the origin of all things, right? I like to say that craving is the architect of the matrix. The Buddha, when he was awakened, he said craving is the builder of this house, right? So another way I like to think of it is that craving is the fire, and the sense of self and the suffering that comes from that assumption is the smoke. So oftentimes we're trying to go directly at non-self conceptually, and it's like spraying water on smoke when we should be spraying water on the fire. But they actually kind of feed each other, right? The sense of ownership, the sense of me and mine, is fabricated by ignorant craving, but it also is the reason why we want things, right? When we think of something as mine, we have more passion towards it. Like, so if the neighbor walks down the sidewalk and keys my car, that's my car, so that's going to make me have an emotional reaction if I'm stupid, right? I'm going to get angry. But, I think personally that I wouldn't think of that as my car if I didn't already have passion towards it. I may have an old beat up car on the street that I have no passion towards, and I may have a brand new car in the driveway. They're both mine, but if somebody keys the old beat up car, I'd be like, no problem. But if they come and key the brand new car, then that's mine, So that's one way of thinking of it. I have other ways of thinking about this, and the selfing is a form of personalizing or personifying what is impersonal, right? And the example that I've used often, I think many people have heard me say this, is that if you look at it externally, our ancestors, when they used to look at a developing storm, let's say a storm develops, it's very dark, the sky gets dark, there's thunder and lightning, and that causes an unpleasant feeling in the body, right? It's a feeling of uncertainty, okay? And that feeling of uncertainty creates an emotional reaction of fear. That's the craving. And then, so what happens? They personified the storm. They said, okay, there's a God that's angry because we didn't do this or that. So then what comes after that? Rites, rules, rituals in order to control. Really what they're trying to control is the fear. But they're telling themselves, our ancestors are telling themselves that they're trying to control the weather. They're trying to appease the gods. But, with the discovery of the law of determinism during the age of enlightenment, right, and the advent of modern science, naturalism came before it in philosophy. But we know that the reason a storm brews is because of positive ions in the air, negative ions in the ground, certain amount of atmospheric pressure, combinations of hot and cold, whatever. I might have some of these elements wrong, but essentially we know that storms arise due to causes and conditions. So knowing that a storm doesn't cause, the feeling that we have is wise feeling when a storm arises. We understand it. We don't create an emotional response of fear, and so we don't personify the storm. That's kind of turning right view outward, but right view has to be oriented inward. That's that samma sankappa, right? You turn right view around towards the internal processes, form, feeling, perception, thinking, sensory consciousness, these 5 aggregates that constitute our entire experience. It's sort of like a constellation of stars that when we look at these 5 aggregates ignorantly, we fabricate a mental image that we call ourselves, right? Just like when we look at the stars, we fabricate a bear or a hunter, right? We project our assumptions onto the stars because we don't know what they really are from the ground. But we do the same thing to these 5 aggregates. So from a place of ignorance, we personify these 5 aggregates as me and mine, and it's a false assumption. So it's the lack of understanding that creates the assumption. So in that sense, you can see that there may even be a layer of self that is more fundamental than craving, but they have this sort of co-creating relationship that's not, they almost co-arise simultaneously. So I've been on both sides of this discussion, which comes first, craving, creating the self, or the sense of ownership, creating craving. But what I can tell you is that they are definitely codependent. When craving is absent from experience, there's definitely no sense of ownership of experience. So that's something that you kind of have to see for yourself. You have to introspect, right? We have to turn that knowledge of conditionality inward and see from within in order to uproot our ignorance about our experience, to break that sense of ownership that we have of it that makes us suffer for it, thinking that we can own what is inherently unownable, I don't know if that answers your question fully.
I have a quick question on what you said there. You said lack of understanding creates a false assumption. So what would you see as a good way of increasing your understanding? And like my first thought would be that it would be like it's just paying close attention and seeing things from different points of view. But I don't know if you had any other suggestions or like what your thoughts on that was.
Yeah. It's an interesting way you phrase that question, actually. Different points of view. Because, the sense of self is itself, in the teachings of the Buddha, a point of view. Rebirth itself, whether you think of rebirth as something that occurs many times throughout the day, as I was explaining earlier, or you feel that, yes, that's the process of rebirth, but that continues, on and on and on from a phenomenological perspective through endless expansions and contractions of the universe, as the Buddha would talk about in the suttas. In either case, the sense of self is the assumption of a point of view within the aggregates within the 5 aggregates at different points in the aggregates. At times, the sense of self is born in the the sankharas and the thinking process. Sometimes it's born in the feeling. Sometimes it's born in the body. Sometimes it's born. We identify with different parts of the 5 aggregate. That's the point of view, right? But what you're talking about when you talk about point of view is views, right? And views are one of the 4 fuels for self to be born, for clinging to be born. Self is fueled by our desire to stimulate the senses. Sensuality, this is how it's stated in the suttas. So sensuality, our belief in certain rites, rules, and rituals, views and opinions, and then a doctrine of self. So these are the 4 different fuels. But there's a sutta where the Buddha talks about the net of views. It's called the Brahma Jala Sutta. And essentially what this comes down to, and then there's also this metaphor where he talks about the 5 blind men with their hands in different points of the elephant, is that the Dhamma is like a theory of everything. It's sort of the one teaching that undermines all teachings, essentially. And so any point of view is incomplete, is basically what the Buddha talks about. Any point of view is incomplete because a view is something that's fabricated from a certain point of view. It's inherently belongs to a self that's situated from a particular perspective, and a view is something that's part of the sense of self. It's a fabrication. So right view isn't really a point of view, and it's not even like an accumulation of multiple points of views. It's not even all, it's sort of the understanding that all views are incomplete. They're views, right? They're fabricated so that we can sort of abandon all views. It's one of the 4 fuels, so it's something that needs to be abandoned in order to undermine clinging. And what's left is a continuity of introspection, a continuity of viewing. So it's continuously paying attention to experience in order to sort of see, the presence or absence of dukkha, or the presence or absence of craving, or the presence or absence of a wrong view. But that requires a continuity of viewing. Go ahead, Brett. I think I see your hand.
So then, in this description, would you agree then that right view is, let us say, that it informs us to avoid clinging to what we are not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a
variety of ticket of views.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's it's about clinging to nothing at all. Clinging itself is the problem. It's like the aggregates are on fire, and that fire is craving and clinging. And then when everything is cooled completely, it's nibbana, the fire goes out. There's no fire at all. It's non-craving, non-clinging, non-holding to views, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, non-ill will. This word non is really helpful in the practice of Dhamma. Because the mind can really justify just about anything, right? Somebody might say something horrible to you, and then you think that you have to have loving kindness towards them, but really metta is non-ill will. It's universal non-ill will. It's having no excuse to ever give rise to ill will, because that's just another fuel for clinging, right? But if you have complete non-ill will, then the mind can't be stirred in that direction, even towards things you don't like going to work. You can have non-ill will towards going to work. You can have non-ill will towards being a parent or caring for an aging parent yourself, or your past. You can have non-ill will towards your past. And, karuna, the second of the Brahma Viharas, is specifically having non-ill will towards those who are suffering. So you can even take the sense of self that you currently have. If it's a suffering self, you can have non-ill will towards that suffering self, because like the Buddha said, these are like anger-eating demons that live inside of us. If we feed them negative emotions, they get bigger, right? They want negative emotion. Some want positive emotion, some want negative emotion. All these different beings that live inside of us, these different selves that we have. So having universal non-ill will, and then having non-ill will towards those who suffer, that's karuna. Non-ill will towards those who are happy and successful, that's mudita. It's the opposite of being jealous, essentially, or envious, because oftentimes selfishness feels jealousy and envy towards those who are successful and happy. So having non-ill will towards happy people. And then, those culminate in the complete non, which is what upekkha is. It's like full complete non. It's apperception. It's seeing this inner process so completely that there's a complete coolness. And that's the highest happiness, second to nibbana, is what the Buddha says. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wanted to rewind back to the discussion about metta. Metta, in the context of Theravada Buddhism, then can be goodwill, and we can easily wish that to everyone, in the sense that, and again, here I agree with Ajahn Thanissaro fully when he says, "May all beings find the causes of true happiness and be willing and able to act on them." And we can wish that to anyone, even someone who's beaten us up and put us in jail, whatever you can hypothesize. Because you don't have to be friends with someone to wish that they, within the context of Dhamma. Because again, like, if we don't like the words loving kindness outside of Dhamma, that's fine. In this context, they have a specific meaning in our practice. I think it's important to keep that in mind when we have the tendency in some generations to worry so much about our English language we can barely use that. So within the context of Dhamma, we can fearlessly use language. And if it doesn't jive or resonate, our friends can let us know. In my humble opinion.
It's a good point. The words kind of have to resonate. You feel the relief. If goodwill brings about that relief from hatred, then that's the word you should use for metta. If non-ill will brings that relief for you, then that works, right? It's an extinguishing of hatred, you can say. So that could be goodwill or non-ill will, however you want to think of it.
Non-ill will, neutral feeling. Nothing wrong with neutral feelings.
And these three poisons that we're talking about of greed, hatred, and delusion, jhana being the practice of non-greed, metta being the practice of non-ill will, and the understanding of the Four Noble Truths being that non-delusion. These are, they're different versions of craving, and craving is thought of as a fire, and the non of them is the cooling of that fire. To bring it back a little bit to sort of this very useful, tangible way that Dhammarato talks about these things, is these are all different forms of dissatisfaction. These are all different ways that the mind is wanting something that it doesn't have in this very moment. And we can use the single perception of everything is already okay, that satisfying, wholesome thought, to kind of cool those three fires here and now and just bring the mind back to settle within itself. Because, everything I've said today, everything that the Buddha teaches, it all comes down to what Ajahn Chah calls realizing the reality of non-grasping, the freedom of non-grasping, the three perceptions of dukkha, of anicca, dukkha, anatta. These are not necessarily about the objects that we want. It's about the wanting itself. Wanting is not satisfying. Dhammarato always says, wanting things we don't have is painful. That is the correct perception of greed, right? Wanting things we don't have is painful. Wanting to get rid of things we don't like is painful, right? That's the dukkha of hatred, of that second of the three poisons. And sort of being confused, careless, distracted, deluded is also painful. It's not understanding things as they are, or believing that we understand things as they are when we don't, that delusion quality is also painful. It's a little bit muddier and more fundamental than the other two. The Buddha uses some similes for these. I remember the one for delusion being the most extreme. Like greed is water colored with dye, hatred is water that's being shaken, and delusion is like water colored with dye being shaken and full of mud all at once, or something like that. I remember it like anyway.
Yep.
But yeah, this idea, this wholesome thought that Dhammarato talks about of everything's already okay. This is kind of what I've been getting at in my long-winded way. Is a way of bringing the mind out of these three unwholesome behaviors of greed, hatred, and delusion, and inviting the mind back to be content within itself, right? Ajahn Mun defined the Four Noble Truths as, the mind going outside of the mind is dukkha, the mind staying within the mind is the ending of dukkha. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But essentially, our mind is divided by dissatisfaction. And reminding ourselves that everything is okay exactly as it is not permission to indulge craving. It's inviting the mind to come to its true home, to rest within itself, so that the mind understands that nothing is missing. Everything is okay. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to become anything. We don't need to get anything. Go ahead, Brett.
That's what the Brahma Viharas are for gladdening the mind within as a first step. And this is what Dhammarato points to when he says, first we gladden the mind.
Mm-hmm.
There's no dukkha in wishing goodwill to yourself for right now and others.
It's definitely a wholesome thought. I think is what Brett you're getting at. Goodwill.
You're talking about delusion. I like that analogy of the mud and the water and stuff like that. Delusion is the ultimate snare. So greed and hatred, I think, are a byproduct of delusion, because you have to have the original sin, or the original delusion of self, in order for greed to arise, or hatred to arise. And greed and hatred is just, that's the extreme version of craving and aversion. Greed is just craving, and hatred is aversion. So, yeah, that's all I had to say.
Thank you.
So like the sense of self that fuels like a need for like something is greed, but also delusional. Is that what you're saying?
It's delusional. It has delusion as its root, its source. It cannot rely. It's like codependent arising with delusion. Or another way to delusion also is ignorance, right? That's the
Moha.
If you look at the
I mean,
what's the difference? Is there a difference? I'm not a poly
they're
expert.
technically speaking.
Difference.
I mean, one is avijja, that's that fundamental ignorance that starts out the chain of dependent origination. And then, loba, moha, loba, dosa, and moha, greed, hatred, and delusion are the three forms of craving. So they're sort of the way that the mind behaves in its state of ignorance, right? So I think of avijja as the habitat, and loba, dosa, moha, greed, hatred, delusion as the behavior that is dependent on that habitat, essentially. So think of yourself in a dark room, right? And that's avijja. All the lights are off, and you reach your hand over under your bed. Let's say you reach your hand under your bed, you feel something furry. And due to the fact that the lights aren't on, the mind is going to have an ignorant response to it. It's going to either have a loba response, a dosa response, or a moha response, right? So it's either going to think it's like a kitty and it's going to want the kitty, or it's going to think it's like a dead rat and it's going to be like, oh, gross, I don't want that. Or it's going to be sort of confused about what it is and either make something up like it's a monster, or it's going to just create a sense of anxiety from not knowing, and that would be like the moha response. So that's sort of
another. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, another thing that made me think of is like the quote when like Jesus is being crucified. He said like, "Forgive them; they know not what they do." Like, so the idea is like hatred comes from not knowing like
Wait,
the
Mhm.
truth. Like, if you know the truth, like you don't hate anyone. If you're ignorant to the truth, you act for
Yeah.
the protection of an illusory self that you've constructed in your mind that isn't actually there except for as a mental construct or like a mental fabrication.
I think what Scott brings up here is a key to a way we could define forgiveness in terms of this context, in that it doesn't necessarily mean what it would mean in classic religion, but more of just that we won't get revenge because we understand that these deeds, whatever misdeeds or we believe or occurred, were predicated by delusion itself. And then if these beings understood truly the consequences of the hatred and greed they're involved in, if they didn't have moha as the root, they wouldn't do these things. No one would.
Mm-hmm. Well, the avijja is not knowing the Four Noble Truths. It's not seeing the dependent origination of this whole mass of suffering and the sort of beginningless cycle of it, right? So we have been reacting to things that please us with greed and reacting to things that displease us with hatred and reacting to uncertainty with anxiety and confusion for, beyond any perceivable beginning, essentially, is what the Buddha says. And that has caused us so much deep and immeasurable suffering and anguish when you understand dukkha, that when you see it at that level, you don't want to do anything that will cause dukkha again. So, if you're being nailed to a cross, you wouldn't have ill will towards the people doing it because that's a cause, for dukkha, right? There's just a deep level of seeing so clearly how deep and how beginningless dukkha is and how clear those causes are. That's the scene of the Four Noble Truths, that it becomes impossible to do anything that would perpetuate that cycle, because you've been in it for so long. You've been enslaved by it, essentially. Yeah, I mean that's the way I would put it, because when the Buddha defines avijja as not seeing the Four Noble Truths, and that sounds so mundane when you hear it, but it's definitely not a mundane thing. It is a completely, it's a complete paradigm shift in the way that we see, experience, and experience the world, essentially. And the self part of that is the absurdity of taking things as me and mine, and the dukkha that comes from that. But there's definitely a lot of there's like a shedding of that whole cycle when dukkha is fully comprehended and its cause is known clearly, essentially. That's what I would. If you're going to get mad because somebody slaps you, you're just perpetuating this. You're just feeding the cycle of getting mad. I like how Ajahn Buddhadasa talks about the Garden of Eden as a really great Buddhist story, right? And Adam and Eve, are in the Garden of Eden. It's complete paradise. They have no sense of self. They have no sense of good and bad, beautiful and ugly. And then, the story goes that the snake convinces Eve to take the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God said, if you take this fruit, you will die. It's the one thing I'm telling you not to do. On the other side of the garden of the tree of life. So they eat of the fruit, and then this first thing that happens is they become aware that they're naked. They develop a sense of self, and from that sense of self, they become ashamed. But another part of the story I was thinking about is somebody had asked, like, what is Mara? And Mara in Buddhism is a personification of craving, right? Mara is the one who keeps us ensnared to the world, keeps us wanting things we don't have. And I was thinking of Mara in the Garden of Eden is the snake, He's in there whispering in Eve's ear, like leading her into this world of judgment where suddenly, there's myself, there's the world, there's good, bad, ugly, inside and outside, all of this duality that destroys paradise. So even in Genesis, there's a Mara, essentially. That's kind of one thing I was thinking about. Kind of interesting.
Like essentially trying to throw up.
It's outside the body.
So the practice is basically seeing Mara and then not getting tricked into being dissatisfied. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say the practice is seeing all dissatisfaction as absurd and stupid and not buying into it at all. Every time Mara whispers in your ear a reason to be dissatisfied, a reason to want something you don't have, that's just the snake trying to get you to perpetuate this cycle that keeps you trapped in samsara, right? Like I've said before, the answer to every question is because I'm not satisfied, but like just as an example, like just the very fact that this present moment experience is in any way not good enough, not completely satisfied, not completely fulfilled, is because you are believing some illusion of dissatisfaction that the mind is producing, that there's something that's missing, there's something that needs to be added, there's something that needs to be understood, there's something that needs to be gotten, that something I need to become, right? It's just the mind is kept slightly off balance all the time by this chronic dissatisfaction. That's what Mara is, Mara is a personification of this chronic dissatisfaction, and we can't ever expect to be safe from Mara's domain, the domain of wanting, because sensuality, again, a lot of people think sensuality is just sensory experience. It's not sensory experience. It's the wanting, the not wanting, and the confusion. That's Mara's domain. It's craving, essentially. It's just another way of talking about craving. It's believing these stories that are constantly being whispered in our ears, if we want to personify in that way. Like, go ahead, Brett.
No, yeah, I was just going to rewind for a minute, if we could, back to the hamburger simile.
Mm-hmm.
So you had said earlier that we've been fabricating based on ignorance since apparently beginningless time, as far as we may know.
Mm-hmm.
So then, on the walk, which you described, where we're taking a walk in our practice, and that walk, you said we may not have a sense of self at all until this contact occurs. So but weren't we already fabricating and craving, looking out for becoming in the world where we could be the one who is out there looking for the hamburger? Otherwise, the contact wouldn't have occurred when it did.
You mean like what brought us to walking?
No, what brought us to the contact, and just as opposed to the scads of other sensory data that weren't apprehended on the aggregate, or mainly the sense media.
the question you're asking is the doorway into the Satipatthana, essentially. You know what I mean? Like, it's this continuous introspection of the body, the feelings, the states of mind, the thoughts. You could even think of it as a continuous exploration or introspection of intention. I've seen Dhammarato even teach this to people. You know, every time you stand up, stop and ask yourself, why did I just stand up? You know, you're trying to discern what's driving the behavior of the body, and getting to the point where you see the body itself as more primary than your sense of ownership of it. And so that's something that it wouldn't even, for me, like, you know, that's something that's useful for us to kind of explore ourselves, because, you know, there's gross levels of craving, but then there's deeper intentions. And when you can discern the non-self nature or the impersonal nature of intention, that is a deep relief, I would say. You know, you can look at that too, and that's something you definitely is
Thank you,
helpful
Michael.
to look at as a practice.
Thank you, Michael. Sadhu.
Oh, thank you, Brett.
I do have a question. I want to see if my understanding of right view is way off or not. But like, my understanding of right view is just experience what exists right now without actually understanding about what is being experienced. Because when you're creating an understanding, it's like creating a story about what's being experienced. But if you just experience what exists without understanding it, is that similar to what right view is?
Hang on a second, my phone did something weird. Am I still there?
Yep.
Yes.
Your audio.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. You know, right view is a complete paradigm shift. You know, it doesn't come about instantly just from looking at experience and not, you know, interpreting it, essentially, because at the center of experience is you, right? You feel that you are occupying the body. You feel that you're thinking your thoughts. You feel that you are, you know, seeing out of your eyes or whatever, that these are your feelings and whatnot. Essentially, like, all experience converges in you. You know, by definition, right view is seeing the Four Noble Truths. It's seeing dependent origination, but that doesn't quite illustrate it. What it really does is it sort of reorients things. It takes you out of the center, and you then see how this sense of me and mine is a product of experience rather than like the one who's experiencing, essentially. And that's one way of understanding it. It's when I was using the analogy of understanding the dependent origination of a storm removes the personification of that storm that comes from the fear of it, right? We no longer see the weather as being governed by gods and goddesses who are either pleased or displeased with us. You know, it's an external thing. It's important, but having that understanding of the dependent origination of dukkha, of the sense of self and the sense of suffering that comes with that sense of ownership, a deep understanding of that essentially is what right view is. We no longer see experience as, you know, I am experiencing a world, but as the world and the I who experiences is a product of, things like intention or the body, feeling, perception, thinking, sensory consciousness. These things are seen to exist and all by their own nature, essentially. They're already here existing. The body is always already here in the background to experience. Thinking is always already here, feeling, perception, things like these things are all already here, and my sense of self, my sense of ownership of these things is secondary to it. It comes as a product. So it takes the self out of the center of experience. And it has the effect of it's the effect is sort of like an immense weight being lifted out of experience. And there's a gradual sort of untethering, you can say, to the body. There's a sort of the patterns of tension that center you in the body then begin to sort of weaken and soften, and the body is sort of seen to be there, functioning on its own. The thoughts are there, function on the intentions. All these things are seen, function on their own, sort of prior to you being there. They're more primary to you being there. It displaces you from the center of experience, and then this sense of you, the sense of me, is almost seen at different times as an afterthought or an after feeling, rather than like something that's primary receiving experience. And yeah, it comes from a continuous introspection. What you were talking about is the practice of wise attention, yoniso manasikara, continuously looking within experience without judging it, without embellishing it, until these things are clarified to such a degree that the experience that I'm describing comes as a result.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I appreciate your explanation. That makes a lot of sense. Like, I have experienced my sense of self being deconstructed and being reconstructed, like when I go for a walk, and I can sort of see it happening. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense when you put it into words, because I never really thought it in words before. But yeah, I appreciate your answer.
And to break it down a little bit more, in right view, we have to be careful not to over-intellectualize it, so we could remember to look. If there's dukkha, we change it in a balanced way throughout our day. Remember, look, change.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think right view is like simple. It's just simply looking. Like most people experience things ignorantly without watching what they're doing, right? If you don't look where you're stepping, you might step in shit, So you gotta watch it, yeah. You gotta look at what you're doing. Wakey, wakey.
With one thing that that's interesting to note, and with this continuity of viewing of sati sampajanya, you can say, or yoniso manasikara, this continuity of looking within introspection until it blooms as seeing within apperception, not having the mind go out to the objects of perception, but actually looking at the process of perception, the process of experiencing, right? Internally, not looking at the object as a desirable object, but looking at desire itself as dukkha and as anicca, looking at desire itself as impermanent, unsatisfying, not me or mine, looking at hatred itself as impermanent, unsatisfying, not me or mine, looking at even just the unfolding process of experience as impermanent, unsatisfying, not me or mine. If we allow ourselves to disown or detach from the objects of perception and rest back into the background, right? We begin to see the senses and the different activities of the mind, the emotional activities of the mind, the thinking, the perception, as though they were entities, right, of their own nature, going about their own nature. There's a talk from Ajahn Fuang about the different consciousnesses and living in the body as entities, and it sounds like he's sort of this magical thing, but he's really describing an experience that you can have from a continuity of introspection, which is discerning these different aspects of the aggregates of the senses of being. The Buddha describes them like animals, right? Like the sense organs, or they each have their own nature. They have no idea that you're here. They don't care that you're here, and they've been conditioned in a certain way in order to produce suffering. So that falling back to the background, and even when Dhammarato talks about having this attitude itself is sort of that background context to experience. If we have the attitude of a victim, like Dhammarato talks about, we're always waiting for an excuse to feel sorry for ourselves, to feel unhappy, to get into a bad mood, to get angry, whatever it may be. But if we have an attitude of letting go, right, that samma sankappa, the attitude of the inclination of letting go of dispassion, of abandoning greed, hatred, and delusion, of non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion is the way the Buddha talks about it. If we have that attitude of renunciation of non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, then that sort of takes over the background context, and the mind then gets in this habit of letting things go. And letting go, or renunciation or relinquishment, however you want to think of it, relinquishment, like giving up ownership, that's the actual delight in the Dhamma. We're training the mind to be happy, not getting things, becoming things, learning things. We're training the mind to delight in letting things go, releasing things, right? And being just okay and happy and satisfied without having to do anything at all. There's this moment of wow, I can be happy without anything at all. I could sit in an empty room doing nothing with no stimulation and be happy as a pig in shit, as my dad would say. Happy as a clam, as some people say, right? So, I mean, sometimes I like to I've been using a lot of the negative terminology that's the negating terminology that's pretty common with the suttas in this conversation today. But sometimes I like to think of the Dhamma in positive terms. And one other way I think of the Dhamma is as this discovery that there is this deep, bottomless wellspring of happiness that is completely causeless within us. And discovering that the mind then becomes more interested in that. It's like, oh, I can just sit here with this deep, causeless wellspring of happiness and rest within it and not need anything at all, right? And then everything else takes care of itself. All this stuff I've said in this conversation, you can forget it. You can just rest in that. You can just rest in this happiness that is unreasonable, is causeless, because that's one thing that's revealed by the Four Noble Truths, is that anything that arises due to a cause. I left this out on the question about right view, right? All things that arise due to a cause are subject to cessation. That's another articulation of the arise. That's the main articulation of the arising of right view, actually. All things that arise are subject to cessation. So we can't take refuge in things that are subject to arising and passing away. We can only take refuge in non-arising, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, just coming back to that place of complete satisfaction, non-activity, right? The stilling of all formations. That's the happiness of the Dhamma. It's just this happiness that's inside experience, not the pleasure that comes from chasing after things. That's suffering. The other thing I just mentioned.